Good morning. Forgive me for not being set up and ready this morning. I thought I was getting here early, but it wasn't early enough.
That's going to take account of me interfering.
Oh, that's all right. I don't mind interference. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So we'll pick up in Acts chapter 9, hopefully where we left off last week. I told Melissa this morning I couldn't remember where we left off last week. So if you don't want me to repeat something, you might want to tell me where that was. Yeah. She told me to do a pop quiz and see what y'all retained. But that's the teacher in her coming out, you know. And I hated pop quizzes in school, and I would not do that to you guys. We'll pick up in verse 20 or so, just as a good starting point. So this is after Saul's conversion. He has his sight again. He's eaten, so he's regained his strength. He's ready to go do what needs to be done. And so the end of verse 19 tells us that Saul was with the disciples in Damascus for some days. We don't know how long. Likely not very long, not years, but we don't know how long it was. But he immediately began proclaiming Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." Now, when I think about stuff like this, I think about, I don't know if I could do that. To go into the place of the Jews, he's going into the synagogue and saying, Jesus is the Messiah. What kind of courage did that take for him to do that after he saw what happened to Jesus? It's not been that long since Jesus was killed for doing the very same thing that Saul was doing now. But Saul was bold. He was courageous. Whether this was because he knew the guys and he felt like they wouldn't do anything to him, or whether he just felt like he had to do this, he still did it. Yeah, go ahead. Sure. Right, Sure. They have to go from being afraid of Saul to listening to Saul. And that is a change in the listener mindset in addition to the change in the teacher mindset. Because we mentioned last week with Saul, he's a go-getter, isn't he? He is very zealous in what he's doing. He's going out and he's arresting anyone that doesn't agree with him, throwing them in jail. He oversaw the stoning of Stephen. So this is a big change in mindset for Saul. And I don't know if it was just a flip of a switch for him, or if it was how long a process this was for him to say, I'm a different guy, Did he retain any of those tendencies to want to immediately act and change and do those things? Or did he, over a course of time, settle those tendencies down? We all have tendencies we have to repress, don't we? Some of us, it's the tendency to go 90 miles an hour in the 50 mile an hour zone. We have to repress that lead foot, don't we? And try to avoid getting tickets, or worse yet, get into an accident where someone gets hurt. We have to repress that. I don't know if Saul had to actively work at repressing his tendency toward aggressiveness, because he was super aggressive. I don't know if he had to work to remold that and remake that into an aggressiveness for good, because he is aggressive here. Even after his conversion, he's aggressively going out and teaching and proclaiming Christ as the Messiah. So I don't know how much he had to work to change that programming, for lack of a better word, that tendency he had for aggression. But verse 21, but all who heard him were astounded and said, "Isn't this the man who in Jerusalem was destroying those who called on this name, and then came here for the purpose of taking them as prisoners to the chief priests?" And the answer is yes. It is most definitely yes. But Saul grew more capable and kept confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that this one is the Messiah. So as Saul, continued to teach and continued to proclaim Christ as the Messiah, he became more skillful, right? Anytime we do something repeatedly over and over and over again, we get better at it. It's practice, repetition. Teachers know that, coaches know that, everyone knows that. You get better with repetition. And so Saul grew more capable and kept confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus. Sometimes we have arguments we can't win, don't we? I don't know about y'all, but I have been on the losing side of arguments before. You might find that hard to believe, but it happens.
You're married, aren't you?
Yeah, I am married, you know. So it goes both ways. Yeah. But you know, we sometimes have arguments that we just can't win. But does that mean that we go away from those arguments? You ever argue something that even though you knew it was wrong just because you didn't want to admit you were wrong? You know, you ever been that stubborn? Glenda's never. So Glenda said she's never done that because she's always right. Go ahead, David. Yeah. You didn't want to give up, yeah. Sure. You know, so sometimes we stick with it just to annoy the other person, don't we? You know, we've done that before. And these guys, these Jews, didn't want to admit that they were wrong. And this is the age-old question, the age-old debate. It started when Jesus came, and it's still going on today. There's still people that argue that Jesus is not the Messiah. And so Saul kept confounding these guys and proving that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And in verse 23, after many days had passed, guess what? The Jews decided to kill him. You know? That's their answer to everything, isn't it? If we can't shut you up and we're not going to join you, we're going to get rid of you, one way or the other. So after many days had passed, the Jews conspired to kill him. Let's see, we already talked about that. Okay, so their plot became known to Saul. So they were watching the gates day and night, intending to kill him. You know, Jerusalem was a walled city. They could control access to their city. And so they were watching the gates day and night, intending to kill him. I don't know how Saul became aware of their plot. There had to have been multiple people involved. There had to have been rumors. Just like rumors spread today, we know what people are intending to do a lot of times. And their plot became known to Saul. So verse 25, his disciples took him by night and lowered him in a large basket through an opening in the wall. Do we see that happen anywhere else in our Bibles? Jericho? Can you think of anyone else? David. His wife let him out through a window so he could escape from Saul. Rahab let the spies out. That was in Joshua 2:15. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, since she lived in a house that was built into the wall of the city. So her house was built literally against the wall of the city. And her house had an opening, a window that went through the wall where she could let the spies down and let them get to safety. And in 1 Samuel 19, verse 12, this is Michal speaking. His wife Michal warned David, if you don't escape tonight, you'll be dead tomorrow. So she lowered David from the window, and he fled and escaped. That's two that I could come up with pretty quickly, where people were desperate for escape. And so they got out through the windows. That was the one weakness in the Jerusalem security. Go ahead.
Weren't there houses built on the wall?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And what we would call an opening today is more like a gap between houses.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to lay him over the top of the wall between two houses, between
So maybe it was a gap between the two houses. I hadn't considered that. But yeah, it could just be an opening in the wall. Let me see.
Well, the wall's really big,
Mm-hmm.
and to have an opening, we would see that as a hole or something.
Right.
And no, I don't think that's what it meant.
Two walls, an outer wall and an inner wall
Usually, yeah.
with a space in between.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how big that space was or how good the security was. This was an opening in Acts. Now in Joshua it says a window. I haven't gone back to look at the Greek on those words. I'll do that. Because Joshua says a window, and I think,
Well, and that could be, if you got a house on top of the wall,
yeah,
who would block that side from
right.
being able to see?
And in 1 Samuel it also says window. So I need to go back and look at the original words, see what that was. I hadn't considered that possibility.
Well, I don't doubt that there's a window in that
Yeah,
situation.
sure. And this one may have just been an opening, who knows? But we'll look at the Greek on that at some point. Oh, and that reminds me, we got into a debate last week about capitalization in a quote. Do we capitalize the first word of a quote or not? You remember that? David was right. Clinton was right. If the quote is a complete sentence, you capitalize the first letter. If it's a partial sentence or an interrupted quote, you don't capitalize it. So I guess we were both right, but my memory was faulty. So I didn't want to mention that this morning. So they lowered him in a large basket through an opening in the wall. So he goes from there to Jerusalem. Now, this makes it sound like it was an immediate thing. But if you go back and look in Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 through 18, it tells us differently. But when God, who from my birth set me apart and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I could preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. I did not go up to Jerusalem to those who had become apostles before me. Instead, I went to Arabia and then came back to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas, and I stayed with him for 15 days. So Luke leaves out a little bit of it here in Acts, but we get the rest of it here in Galatians, where he doesn't go immediately to Jerusalem. He goes to Damascus to Arabia for about 3 years, teaching and doing what he needs to do there before he ever comes back to meet one of the apostles. So when he arrived in Jerusalem, he tried to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, since they didn't believe that he was a disciple. So I mentioned a guy last week named Jeffrey Dahmer. All of y'all remember Jeffrey Dahmer? Who was he? Serial killer. Ate his victims. Cannibal. Pretty nasty guy, right? So I mentioned him as kind of a reference point here because Jeffrey Dahmer, if you believe the reports, and I wasn't there, so I can't verify personally, but he apparently repented and became a Christian while he was in jail. So if Jeffrey Dahmer, and he's gone now, but if Jeffrey Dahmer would have been released and he'd come to sit in this church in our pews, what do you think would have happened?
He'd probably sitting alone.
He'd probably be sitting alone, and one of our folks that function as unofficial security here would probably be keeping a really close watch on him, wouldn't they? Would we immediately trust him? We would not immediately trust him, would we? We would not let him be alone with anyone in this building. You know? We just wouldn't do that. The conversion of Saul was basically the same thing, isn't it? Let's nod our heads, because it's basically the same thing. Because Saul was terrorizing people the way Jeffrey Dahmer terrorized people. So I'm not saying he was legit or that we would need to listen to him or anything like that. But I just want us to think about how accepting we would be of that type of change in a person before we condemn the Christians in Jerusalem here for not believing Saul. Okay? Because that will be a hard change to get over when you're thinking about trusting someone and believing what they say. And we're going to see down here in verse 27, Barnabas. And we need to talk about Barnabas a little bit. The ladies did a class, a series of classes about Barnabas on Wednesday evenings. And they know more about Barnabas than I do at this point. Okay? But Barnabas is a special kind of guy. And we're going to need to slow down and talk about him. But they didn't believe that Saul had been converted any more than you or I would have believed it had we lived in that time frame. We wouldn't have believed it for a second. Because of everything that we had heard about Saul, we would not have believed it. So the Christians there were going to take some convincing. Verse 27, Barnabas, however, took him and brought him to the apostles and explained to them how Saul had seen the Lord on the road and that he had talked to him, and how in Damascus he had spoken boldly in the name of Jesus. So what do we know about Barnabas? Ladies, feel free to speak up. He was an encourager. That was the focus of the book that y'all studied on Wednesday night, was his encouraging side. Do we know anything else about Barnabas?
His name means son of consolation.
Mm-hmm. Means son of consolation. Encourager. Sure. Sure. Basically the same thing. So let's look at a few things here about Barnabas. I put some facts in here that I got off of a website, but just some facts about Barnabas. Barnabas gave generously to the fledgling Christian movement. That's in Acts chapter 4. We read about that at the time in Acts chapter 4. Barnabas vouched for the integrity of Saul. Here, we're studying about that now. Barnabas partnered with Saul to teach the believers at Antioch, and that's in Acts chapter 11. This specifies Syrian Antioch because there is more than one Antioch that we read of in the Bible. Barnabas joined with Saul in bringing famine relief to the Christians in Judea. We'll see that in Acts chapter 11. He also took a lead role with Saul in the first recorded missionary journey of the early church. That was in Acts chapter 12. So, Barnabas didn't just do this here. His relationship with Saul was more of a mentor-mentee relationship. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. But let me get back up here to the top. So let's consider Barnabas for a little bit this morning. Barnabas in this passage is not just an encourager. He is a bridge between Saul and the Christians. Barnabas was obviously someone they trusted, right? They trusted Barnabas. He had a history with them, and they could believe what he said. He was an apostle, and undoubtedly he had been seen as a leader for some time here at this point. So this is Barnabas. Now, he did what great leaders do here, didn't he? He smoothed the way for Saul. He made it possible for Saul to do what needed to be done. Sometimes leaders are hesitant, aren't they? Sometimes we're hesitant to allow change. But this is not what Barnabas did here. I don't know if Barnabas knew exactly how much of a role that Saul would play in the formation of the church. If this was revealed to him, we have no record of that. But leaders are sometimes afraid to step aside and let someone else lead, for fear that they might surpass them, or fear that what they had worked so hard to build could be destroyed. Okay, so when you're in a leadership role and you're responsible for growth and for great things, as some people are responsible for great things, you're worried about succession. You're worried about who's going to come next, who's going to take over when I'm not there anymore. I don't know if Barnabas was aware that Saul would surpass him or not. But in terms of teaching and exactly what he was going to do later on down the road, we would consider Saul to have surpassed Barnabas. Clinton? Oh, okay. In leaders, this can be an issue with pride and ego. We become proud of what we, and I'm air quoting we, have done sometimes without thinking about all the other people that assisted us on our journey. If this was a problem for Barnabas, we don't see it here. We don't have any record of that. Some leaders might work behind the scenes or publicly to undermine Saul to keep people from listening to him. That's what the Jews did to Jesus. They undermined him every opportunity they got. Barnabas obviously does not do that. He is the antithesis of Jewish leadership. He's the direct opposite, isn't he? So not only has he accepted Jesus as the Messiah, but he's also accepted Saul as a teacher and as a leader and as someone that would be an asset to the Christian movement. Saul needed someone that would pave that way, someone that would allow him to get in where people would listen. Barnabas had his priorities straight and his ego in check. He did what was needed to assist Saul in his ministry. And he goes on to assist Saul in his missionary journeys and with some of the other things that go on. We'll encounter Barnabas several times throughout the book of Acts. Barnabas functions much like a mentor for Saul. And we'll see that as we move through Acts, and we'll kind of point that out. This is a reminder to me, anyway, that everyone needs someone in their life to fill this role. We all need people that are willing to take us under their wing and be that mentor, that guide, as we move from young person to young adult to older adult to senior adult. We need someone that's going to kind of guide us and show us the way, Clint.
I don't necessarily trust Wikipedia, but
Yeah.
they do say that someone named Tertullian has actually named Paul or Barnabas as the author.
Okay. So there's debate about the authorship of Hebrews. Tertullian, who is a historian from back in that time, has said that it was Barnabas. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think we'll ever know for sure.
Do we know what Peter's position was in all of this with Saul? Peter, I always considered him to be a leader of the early church too.
Right.
And it's not long after this that he sees the vision.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't find any record of him saying anything about Paul.
We don't see Peter and Saul getting together until later on. To our knowledge and to our record, we have no interaction between those two. Yeah, about Mark. Yeah, they disagreed about Mark. And we'll see that later on as we move through Acts as well, that they disagreed. And that's a change in the mentor-mentee relationship from that of Barnabas being the older, wiser guy that gets to make all the decisions, to Paul at that point saying, I don't agree with you, and clashing with him, and moving more into a peer relationship with Barnabas than what he is at this point. So I don't know exactly. Peter and Saul, they had some dealings with each other, if not directly, indirectly, with the ministry of Jesus and the fact that Saul was a member of the Sanhedrin. They were aware of each other. Now, whether they formally met, talked, discussed things, we don't have any record of that. But as we think about this, we need to realize that we all need this kind of person in our lives. I can think of several people in my life that have held that role for me, all the way back through high school, that played a mentoring role inside the church and outside the church, and kind of formed the person that I am today, for good or bad. Whether you like me or not, they played a role in forming who I am today. We all need that mentor role. We need someone to fill that in our lives. We see that with families where you're missing a mother or a father. There have been numerous studies showing that people that come from two-parent households do better than people that come from one-parent households. That's a generalization. That's not every case. There are exceptions. But people that can fill those roles and be those mentors to people to help them grow into the leaders and people they're capable of becoming. I've told you before, my theory on leadership is that some are born into the ability to be a leader. You see that among young children out on the playground at recess. There are some from a very young age that they draw other kids to them. For whatever reason, other kids are drawn to them. They become the leader of the group. Now, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's not okay. Because sometimes those kids that draw kids to them are bullies, and that's where you get gangs and all kinds of stuff happening in the school system. So you see that from an early age. But then you also see people that grow into a leadership role. Just a personal thing. Those of you that knew me when I was a kid, there's several of y'all in here today that knew me as a young person. You would have never expected me to be up here. That would not have been expected. I was the kid who sat by himself at a recess in elementary school in the early years. I was very much an introvert, much worse than I am now, which is kind of hard to believe. But, it was much worse than what I am now. No one when I was 5, 6, 7 years old would have thought that I'd be sitting up here teaching a class. That wasn't something I was born to do. I didn't have that innate skill. No one would have expected me to stand up and speak in front of people, either here or in the work setting, wherever I do that stuff. But that was developed in me. Those mentors that I had saw the potential that I didn't know I had, and they developed that in me over the course of 30 and 40 years. So in order to have people around us reach their full potential, we need to help. We need to have those mentors in our lives. Now, sometimes we set up a formal mentoring relationship where this is we do this, and this is part of your education. And so we set up that formal mentorship, and so there are grades assigned, and there are classes taught, and there are continuing education courses to be done, and other times it's much less formal than that. As a matter of fact, in terms of my mentorship, very little of the mentoring that I had done with me was in the formal setting of education where there were tests and grades and all this stuff. Most of it was done just as Jesus did. How did Jesus mentor his disciples? Teaching? Example? Did he send them off to a leadership training academy somewhere? Didn't do that. Did he require them to do X amount of reading in their off hours every night before they went to bed? If he did, we have no record of it. That wasn't his style anyway. His was what we would call a soft mentorship, where there's no formal stuff set up. But yet he drew those guys in, and what he did was he taught, not specifically to them, but just in general, he taught. They absorbed everything he said. He brought them into a relationship with himself where they could see how he lived his life, how he dealt with other people, how he dealt with conflict, how he dealt with conflict resolution, how he related to God. He let them see all of that. There was a transparency there that we sometimes struggle with here on earth. He let them in.
We can't do as we teach.
We have a hard time doing as we teach, don't we?
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, how many times have we said that to ourselves? Huh? So Jesus allowed them in, and there was a transparency there that allowed them to see what it was he wanted them to become. And then he modeled that every day of his life. And so as we think about our relationship with those that we might have a mentoring relationship with, whether it be our own kids, whether it be kids here at church, whether it be young adults here at church, young adults in the workplace, transparency is important. Because we are not Jesus, as David so aptly pointed out. We have a hard time practicing what we preach.
That's often seen as a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
You say good, I say not, I do, so we're supposed to be. In line with that.
Mm-hmm.
But as you just said, we're human.
Yeah, we're human. And so we need to acknowledge our own weaknesses, don't we? And we need to say to those that we mentor, I messed up right here. Don't you do the same thing I did. You're in this situation now. Here's what I did. This is what went wrong. And this is how it can be done better. And show them a better way to live. And we can't do that if we won't accept our own failings and our own mistakes. If our pride gets in the way and we just won't admit that we ever mess up. Because we all do. As much as we don't like to talk about it, we do mess up. And so we need to let them in and let them see all of that. And let them know that just because you mess up, it doesn't mean you can't be effective. It doesn't mean that you can't still do the work that God has intended for you to do. And if we look at leadership examples throughout the Bible, there wasn't a single one of them that was perfect, were there? Other than Jesus. Name me one of them that didn't mess up somewhere. It's going to be an awfully short list, because there won't be anyone on it. How did David mess up? How many different ways did he mess up? Maybe be the better question. From murder to adultery to all kinds of lies, and David messed up. What about Moses? Moses messed up. Struck a rock out of anger. Instead of asking for water, he struck it and commanded water. He got angry. He messed up. That wasn't the only time. What about Noah? He built the ark, right? What did he do after he got back on dry land? He got drunk. Messed up. Did stuff he wasn't supposed to do. We've been studying about Saul and all the ways that he messed up. What did Peter do? Cut off Malchus's ear? Took a step that Jesus didn't want him to take. Jesus got onto him for that. So it doesn't matter who you want to look at in the Bible. They all messed up. Every one of them. And in ways that we would consider terrible. And in ways that those of us in this room would never do. I would never kill a person. I don't ever see that happen. So as leaders, we need to recognize that. Because there's not a person in this room that's not a leader somewhere. It doesn't matter if you're young or old or male or female or any of that. You're a leader somewhere. Whether it be in your homes, whether it be in the church, whether it be in the workplace, whether it be in your coffee club. We're all a leader somewhere. And so as we consider leadership and the ways that we become more effective leaders in whatever environment we find ourselves in, we have a lot of important lessons that we need to take from Scripture. And this is one of them. We're going to see Barnabas do some other leadership things here as we move forward that we'll talk about, but Barnabas was an exceptional leader. Absolutely exceptional. And he's one that we need to study the example of as we move through this. Just as a reminder, we know from Galatians 1:18-19 that the only apostles that he met here were James, Jesus' brother, and Peter. This is the first situation where we see Saul and Peter interacting. It's the only record we have of that. All right, so Barnabas took him, brought him to the apostles, explained how Saul had seen the Lord on the road, that he had taught to him how in Damascus he had spoken boldly in the name of Jesus. And apparently that was enough, wasn't it? Because verse 28 tells us Saul was coming and going with them in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. So Barnabas' actions here led to the acceptance of Saul, led others to listen to him and to be willing to sit at his feet and learn what needed to be learned. So we'll talk more about that next week. Thank you for your attention and for being here this morning.